The first image you need to hold in your mind is this: a diner full of people on a cold December morning. Every booth taken, every stool at the counter occupied. The smell of coffee and cinnamon so thick it feels like something you could hold in your hands. An old jukebox in the corner, throwing colored light across the faces of men and women who look like they haven't smiled in years and are smiling now. A man who must be 90-something, wearing a military dress uniform, with medals that catch the light, lifting a coffee cup slowly, deliberately, the way men of that generation do everything. Like the gesture itself is a form of prayer. And behind the counter, barely visible through the pass-through window to the kitchen, a man in his mid-50s with flour on his forearms and grease burns on his hands, moving with the focused efficiency of someone who has spent a lifetime building things. He is not looking at the crowd. He is looking at the plate in front of him, making sure it is right, making sure it is exactly right, because that is the only way he knows how to do anything. His name is Walter Crane. Hold that image. Now let it go. 3 weeks earlier, the truck died on Route 9 just past the sign that said Crestfall Population 800, and Walter sat behind the wheel for a long time after the engine went quiet, listening to the sound of nothing. His hands were still on the cracked leather. The dashboard had gone dark. Outside, the Kentucky sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind was the kind that doesn't just touch you, it finds the gaps in your clothing and stays there. His son Caleb sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. He had said very little in the last 4 hours. Walter couldn't blame him. There wasn't much left to say. The words they needed didn't exist yet, or if they did, neither man had learned them. There are situations in life that language hasn't caught up to yet. Situations where the silence between two people contains more than any sentence could, where speaking would be a kind of reduction, a narrowing of something that was too large to be narrowed. This was one of those situations. Walter opened the door and stepped down onto the shoulder of the road. The cold hit him across the face, and he stood for a moment, just breathing it in, letting his eyes adjust to the flatness of the landscape around him. Bare fields stretched in every direction, the last of the season's growth long gone, the earth dark and waiting. A grain elevator in the distance with peeling paint. A water tower with a name on it that had faded to illegibility. A main street that ran about 4 blocks and then simply stopped, as if the town had started to become something and then thought better of it. He reached back into the cab and lifted out the toolbox. It was red metal, scratched and dented from decades of work, with initials stamped into the lid that were not Walter's initials. They were his father's. W.C. William Crane. The old man had bought the box in 1959 with his first real paycheck, used it for 30 years, and handed it to Walter on the day Walter started his first construction job at 19 years old. He'd said, "Take care of the tools, and the tools will take care of you." It was the most straightforward piece of advice Walter had ever received, and over 30 years he had found no reason to disagree with it. He set the toolbox on the ground and looked at Caleb, who had climbed out and was standing with his jacket pulled tight, his breath visible in the cold air. Caleb was 28. He had his mother's jaw and Walter's eyes, which meant he had a face built for honesty, whether he wanted it to be or not. He had been an accountant before all this. He had his own apartment in Louisville, a steady job, a girlfriend named Sandra, who had stopped returning his calls 2 months ago. He had given up all of it to come help his father when the company collapsed, had moved out of his apartment and packed a bag and shown up at the door of the house that was already in foreclosure and said simply, "I'm here. What do we do next?" And Walter had let him here. Here being the shoulder of Route 943 dollars in a wallet and whatever change had collected in the ashtray over the last several months, 2 duffel bags, 1 toolbox, and a truck that would never start again. "Well," Walter said. Caleb said nothing. "We walk." They picked up their bags. Walter took the toolbox. And they walked into Crestfall, Kentucky, which looked like a place that had spent 20 years learning how to accept loss and had gotten very good at it. Main Street was 4 blocks of buildings that had once been proud. You could still see it in the architecture if you knew how to look. Walter knew how to look. Brick facades with cornices that someone had designed carefully, not just built. Large storefront windows meant to display things worth wanting. Wide sidewalks for foot traffic that no longer came. But the windows were boarded or broken, the boards themselves gone gray and soft with weather. Paint peeled from every surface. Weeds had found every crack in the concrete and decided it was home. A banner stretched across the street announcing a fall festival. The year on the banner was 2022. Nobody had bothered to take it down. Walter counted the empty storefronts as he walked. It was a habit from his contracting days, the instinct to assess to catalog what was broken and what could be fixed. He counted 11 empty buildings in 4 blocks, a closed bank with soaped windows, a former hardware store with a faded sign, a laundromat with plywood where the glass had been, an old insurance office with its sign still on, but its door handle missing, and at the very end of the block, set back slightly from the street as if it had been trying to make itself smaller, a building that was wider than the others and lower with a flat roof and large windows all along the front, all of them covered in sheets of weathered plywood. Above the door, almost invisible beneath years of grime, were the faded outlines of painted letters. Millstone Diner. Walter stopped. He didn't know why exactly. He had seen 100 abandoned buildings in his career. He had torn some of them down and rebuilt others. He knew an abandoned building the way a doctor knows a body by its structure, its fundamentals, the things underneath the surface that told you whether what you were looking at was salvageable or beyond saving. He looked at this one. The foundation was solid. He could see that from here. The walls were plumb, not leaning, not bowing, standing the way walls stand when the ground beneath them is reliable. The roof had a slight sag in the center section, but not the deep bow that meant structural failure, not the kind of sag that told you the whole thing was going to come down on you. The windows were intact beneath the plywood. The siding had lost most of its paint, but that was cosmetic. That was nothing. The bones were good. "What are you looking at?" Caleb asked. "Nothing," Walter said, and they kept walking. The woman at the grocery store was named Agnes Whitfield. She was 55 years old and had the manner of someone who had heard a great many hard luck stories and had learned to evaluate them quickly and without sentimentality. She looked Walter and Caleb over from behind the register while a space heater hummed near her feet and a small television on the shelf played a news program with the volume low. "Truck broke down," Walter said. "We need somewhere to stay tonight, maybe a couple of nights." "Motel closed 12 years ago," Agnes said. "Nearest one is 20 miles south. Shelter church program. Town's too small for that. Most people in trouble here have family." She looked at them steadily. "You got family somewhere." Walter thought about that. He had a brother in Pittsburgh who he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, the kind of silence that grows between brothers when one of them succeeds for a long time and then fails catastrophically and can't bear to be witnessed in the failure. He had a sister in Tucson who had called once after the business collapsed and then gone back to her own life with the particular relief of someone who has discharged a small obligation. He had a son standing next to him who had given up everything to be here and still didn't blame him out loud, which was either grace or restraint, and Walter wasn't sure he deserved either. "Not close enough," he said. Agnes studied them for another moment, the way a person studies a situation they have already made a decision about, but want to be sure of. Then she wrote a name on the back of a receipt and slid it across the counter. "Earl Hutchins, post office 2 blocks east. He knows everyone and everything in this town. If there's any place you can stay, he'll know about it." She paused. "Tell him I sent you. He'll listen better." Earl Hutchins was 65, thin, in the way of men who have always been thin and never thought much about it, with the patient, deliberate movements of someone who has spent decades doing careful work in a small space. He was sorting mail when Walter and Caleb walked in, holding each piece with the attention of a man who understands that what passes through his hands matters to someone, and he listened to their situation without interrupting, which Walter appreciated more than he could say. The ability to listen without redirecting, without offering premature solutions, without performing sympathy, that ability is rarer than it should be. "There's the old diner on the corner of Main and 4th, Earl said when Walter finished. "Millstone, been closed since '87. Owner's a woman named Evelyn Marsh. She's 82, lives in Lexington now with her daughter. She's been trying to sell the place for years, but nobody's made a serious offer." He paused, thinking it through. "I could call her, see if she'd let you stay there a few days, keep an eye on the place." "We'd keep it secure," Walter said. "I'm a contractor. Was a contractor. I'd make sure nothing got damaged." Earl picked up the phone. The conversation was brief. Evelyn Marsh sounded like a woman watching television in a warm room, slightly distracted, asking the same question twice before accepting the answer, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone who has reached an age where the present is less vivid than the past. When Earl hung up, he retrieved a key ring from a drawer and set it on the counter. "Keys have been here since 1989, he said. She forgot she left them." He slid the keys across the counter and looked at Walter directly, the way men of his generation looked at each other when they wanted to say something real without making a ceremony of it. "You need anything while you're here, you come back to me. This town doesn't have much, but we don't let people disappear either." The padlock was stiff, and the key fought it for a moment before turning. Walter unwound the chain from the door handles and pushed the door open. The smell came first. Dust and mildew. Old grease, something underneath all of it that was harder to name, the particular stillness of a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. Not decay exactly, more like suspension. Like the building had simply been waiting with the patience that only buildings possess for someone to return. Walter found the light switch and flipped it without expecting anything. Overhead fluorescent tubes flickered and buzzed, and then reluctantly, with the grumbling compliance of something that has been asked to do too much after too long, a rest cast their flat light over what lay inside. The Millstone Diner was frozen in October of 1987. Booths lined the front windows, their red vinyl cracked and faded to a color somewhere between burgundy and rust. A long counter ran down the left side with round swivel stools, several of them missing their padded seats, the chrome stems standing up like bare stalks in a winter field. Behind the counter, visible through a rectangular pass-through window, was a kitchen. The walls were yellow, or had been. Once now, they were the color of paper left in sunlight, too long, a yellowing that had gone past warmth into something more like exhaustion. Black and white photographs hung in frames along the far wall. The diner full of people in some better decade. The street outside in a different era, when the street had people on it. A factory with smokestacks rising against a bright sky. Men in work clothes walking through a gate with the particular posture of men who have somewhere to be. Dust covered everything equally without preference, the way time covers everything. The floor tiles were cracked in a pattern that suggested someone had dropped something very heavy at some point and nobody had ever fixed it. Water stains marked the ceiling in shapes that meant nothing and everything. Caleb stood in the doorway and looked at all of it and said nothing. Walter walked in. He moved through the space the way he had moved through 1,000 job sites over 30 years, not looking at what it was but reading what it told him. He pressed a palm against the wall near the door. Solid. He crouched and looked at the baseboards. The wood had swollen in some places but wasn't rotted through. He stood and looked at the ceiling sag again, estimating, calculating the load distribution, mentally checking the roof structure above it. He walked behind the counter and ran his hand along the surface. Beneath the grime, it was solid wood, scarred, but not compromised, the kind of surface that could be brought back if someone was willing to put in the time. "This is where we're sleeping," Caleb said. Not quite a question. "This is where we're staying," Walter said. He heard the difference in his own words. He wasn't sure yet what it meant, but he heard it. They cleared the worst of the dust from a corner of the back room, laid their sleeping bags on the floor and ate cold soup from cans, because there was no working stove yet, sitting with their backs against the wall in the thin light of a single flashlight. The night pressed against the boarded windows, and the building made the sounds that old buildings make, settling, sighing, adjusting itself the way a person adjusts when they've been holding a position too long and are finally allowed to shift, and Walter lay awake for a long time listening to them, listening to the building breathe. At some point in the early hours of the morning, unable to sleep, Walter reached for the toolbox. He had done this for years. Not consciously, not with any particular plan. It was simply what his hands did when his mind wouldn't quiet. The ritual of it. Open the box, take inventory, hold the familiar weight of tools worn smooth by 3 generations of use. There was something settling about it that he had never been able to fully articulate. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that these things were real and unchanged and exactly where they were supposed to be. He popped the latches and lifted the lid. In the light of his flashlight, the tools lay in their accustomed positions. The hammer his father had bought in 1963, its handle worn to a particular smoothness that fit Walter's grip as if made for it. The set of screwdrivers worn to perfect handles by constant use. The level that still read true, that had read true through everything, through 30 years of job sites, through the move out of the house, through the truck and the road and this coal floor. The wrenches nested in the leather roll his father had made himself from a piece of harness leather he'd found in a barn somewhere. Walter took them out one by one, checking them the way he always had, making sure nothing had shifted or been damaged in the move. He reached the bottom of the box, lifted the worn fabric liner he had replaced twice over the years, running his hand beneath it to check for anything that might have worked its way under, and found something he had never seen before. A folded piece of paper yellowed at the edges, creased from decades in the same position. Walter's name on the outside in his father's handwriting. Just Walter, no last name, because there was only one Walter who would ever find this. He unfolded it carefully, the paper fragile in a way that told him it had been there a long time, that it had been waiting in the dark beneath the liner through all the years Walter had opened this box and never thought to look quite this deep. It was a short note. His father had never been a man of long speeches. If you're reading this in hard times, and I figure hard times is the only reason you'd look this deep in the box, I want you to remember something. The tools are yours, but the work is what you're made of. Crane men build. They don't run. Whatever's gone wrong, whatever you've lost, your hands still know what to do. Trust that. I love you, son. Dad Walter sat on the floor of the Millstone Diner for a long time with the note in his hands. He had gone through his father's tools 100 times, hundreds of times over 35 years. He had never found this, which meant William Crane had placed it there after handing the box over, had taken it back. At some point, some quiet afternoon in the workshop, when Walter wasn't there, lifted the liner, put the note underneath, replaced everything exactly as it had been, set the toolbox back where Walter would find it, and never said a word about it, had just trusted that his son would find it when he needed it. Walter did not make a sound. He sat in the dark of that diner and read the words 3 times and then a fourth, and then he folded the paper very carefully along its original creases and held it in his closed fist for a while, feeling the slight warmth of it before placing it back beneath the liner. He lay down in his sleeping bag and looked at the ceiling where the water stains made their meaningless shapes, and he thought about a man who had known, without being told, that his son would one day need to look deep enough to find something waiting for him. When Caleb woke at 7, he found his father already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, working. The percolator was on the 3rd shelf of the storage room behind a case of restaurant-grade ketchup that had gone to dust decades ago. Stainless steel, heavy, built in an era when things were built to outlast the person who bought them. Walter carried it to the sink, turned the water main carefully first, just a quarter turn, listening for sounds that would indicate a compromised line, and waited while rust-colored water sputtered from the faucet and slowly, grudgingly ran clear. He disassembled the percolator, completely washing each part with the methodical attention of a man who has learned that the difference between something that works and something that doesn't is usually a question of whether anyone bothered to clean it properly. He checked the stem and gasket and basket, found a vacuum-sealed canister of coffee on the same shelf, years expired, but still sealed, still carrying the ghost of its original smell when he pried the lid. "That thing is never going to work," Caleb said from the doorway, watching his father reassemble a machine that had been sitting untouched since the Reagan administration. Walter plugged it in. The heating element glowed red. The water began to warm. And then, improbably, stubbornly, after God only knows how many years sitting in that storage room in the dark, patient, as everything in this building seemed to be patient, the percolator began to perk. That sound, that particular, unhurried, completely reliable sound of coffee working its way up through the stem and spreading its color through the chamber. A sound that is, when you get right down to it, one of the most reassuring sounds a kitchen can produce. They stood in the kitchen together and watched it happen. Walter poured 2 mugs. The coffee was weak and slightly flat, the flavor muted by years in the canister, but it was hot, and in a building that had been cold for 37 years, hot was everything. Caleb wrapped both hands around his mug and closed his eyes for a moment, and Walter watched his son and felt something shift inside himself. Small and quiet, the way real things often are. He had fixed one small thing. That was all. One small, inconsequential thing in the context of everything that was broken. But somehow it mattered more than the arithmetic suggested it should. Earl Hutchins arrived at 8 with a paper bag he set on the counter without ceremony. Bread, eggs, butter, the basics, carried without comment, offered without performance. He looked around the diner with the slow, careful gaze of a man revisiting something he had carried in memory for a long time and is now checking the memory against the reality. Used to come here every Saturday, he said. Sat at that stool, the third one. Mr. Harold Marsh always had the coffee ready before I sat down. Knew what every regular wanted before they asked. He walked the length of the counter, trailing one hand along its surface, his fingers reading the wood the way a person reads something they know by heart. My wife Eleanor and I had our first real conversation here. Not a date, we'd already been on dates. But the first time we talked like we were going to know each other for the rest of our lives. Right there. He pointed at the booth nearest the door. She ordered the tea. I ordered coffee. We stayed until closing. Walter listened. He had noticed this in his years of contracting, the way people talked about the buildings they had loved. Not about the architecture, not about the materials, not about any of the things that contractors thought about when they looked at a building, but about what had happened inside them. The buildings were just containers. What people remembered was what the containers had held. What happened to her? Caleb asked. 4 years ago, Earl said. He said it without additional explanation, in the way that men of a certain generation announce the central loss of their life. Brief, definite. The door closed, already absorbed into the structure of who he was now. He left them the bag of groceries and refused payment for it. At the door he paused with his hand on the frame. If you need anything else, you come find me. And don't worry about Evelyn. She's good people, even if she gets confused sometimes about what's hers to give. After he left, Walter and Caleb cooked eggs on the gas range, which ignited after 3 tries, the pilot struggling to remember its purpose after decades of disuse. They ate standing at the counter, looking out through the narrow gaps in the plywood at the empty street, watching a town that didn't know yet that anything had changed. The food was simple and exactly right, the way simple food is when you're genuinely hungry and someone has cooked it with attention. Dorothy Mercer appeared on the second day. She was 70 years old and had a retired schoolteacher's posture. Straight spine, unhurried presence, the air of a person who had learned through 40 years of teaching that patience was not passive but active, a deliberate choice made moment by moment. She carried a covered dish and knocked on the door with the confidence of someone who has decided they are welcome before being invited, which is a particular kind of confidence that is different from arrogance because it comes from genuine goodwill rather than self-regard. I've been watching you from across the street, she said when Walter opened the door. My house is the white one. I watched the lights come on 2 nights ago for the first time in decades, and I thought, well, I should either call the police or bring a casserole, and I decided on the casserole. She stepped inside without waiting for a further response. She moved through the diner the way Earl had, slowly touching surfaces, looking at photographs, standing in certain spots, as if testing whether the memory she carried matched the reality of the place. She moved with the deliberate reverence of someone walking through a space that holds significant history, her hand trailing along the counter, her eyes stopping at each photograph. She stopped at the corner booth. I had my first date with my husband here, she said. Stanley. He passed 10 years ago. He was so nervous, he spilled his water twice. And Betty, she was the waitress. She'd worked here 15 years. Betty just brought him a fresh glass and winked at me like we were in on a secret together. Like she was saying, this one's worth keeping. She ran her hand over the cracked vinyl of the seat with the gentleness you'd use on something breakable. He proposed to me at this same table, 11 years after that first date. He'd been working up to it the whole time, I think. That was Stanley. He needed to be sure. She looked at Walter. You're fixing this place up. Just making it livable while we figure out our next move. Is that all? Walter didn't answer that. He had learned over the past year that some questions were better met with silence than with answers that weren't ready yet. Dorothy left the casserole, which was chicken and rice perfectly seasoned, made with the kind of care that comes from someone who has cooked thousands of meals and understands that cooking for another person is a form of paying attention to them. She also left 2 phone numbers, hers and Agnes Whitfield's, and a statement rather than a question. You'll need things. People around here have things to spare. That evening, Walter and Caleb ate the casserole sitting at the counter as the sun went down behind the boarded windows. Neither of them said much, but something between them had shifted slightly, the way the pressure in a room shifts when a window is opened, not dramatically, not all at once, but perceptibly, a loosening. It was on the third day that Walter found the blueprint. He had started in the back storage room working systematically, moving from one section to the next, the way you approach any large project, beginning with what was most compromised and working toward what still held, establishing a hierarchy of need. One section of wall paneling had taken water damage at some point and had gone soft and dark. Walter removed it carefully, checking the structure behind it, making sure the wall studs were sound before moving on. Behind the second panel, folded and placed flat against the wall studs, as if someone had stored it there deliberately, not hidden exactly, but protected, laid in the one place in the room that was dry and stable, was a sheet of drafting paper. Large, yellowed, folded in quarters. Walter unfolded it on the floor of the storage room, crouching over it with his flashlight. It was a renovation blueprint, hand-drawn, meticulously detailed. Kitchen reconfiguration, counter expansion, electrical updates, structural reinforcements. Dated in the corner July 1987. In the title block in careful block lettering that spoke of someone who took precision seriously. Millstone Diner proposed improvements. H. Marsh. Harold Marsh. The man who had built this place and run it for decades, whose wife Evelyn, who believed she still owned it, had given them the keys. Walter studied the blueprint for a long time. The kitchen reconfiguration Harold had planned was almost exactly what Walter had been considering. The same logic, the same priorities, the instinct of someone who understood how a working kitchen should breathe and move. The counter expansion followed the same geometry that Walter had sketched mentally on his first walk through his contractor's eye, automatically reading the room's potential. The structural reinforcements addressed the same points Walter had identified when he pressed his hand against the wall that first night. Two men separated by 37 years, who had never met and never would, standing in the same building and seeing the same thing. At the bottom of the blueprint, in different handwriting, smaller slightly, hurried, written at a different time than the careful drafting above it, written perhaps when something had already begun to go wrong, was a single line in pencil. If I can get through this winter, I can save this place. The textile mill had closed in July of 1987. The diner had lasted until October, trying to hold on without its customer base running on reserves and loyalty, and the stubbornness of a man who had built something worth keeping. Harold Marsh had drawn this blueprint and written that note in the same month the mill closed. He had been trying to find a way through. He had believed in July that there was a way through. He had run out of time. Walter sat back on his heels and looked at the blueprint, and then at the space around him, and then at the blueprint again. Caleb found him there 10 minutes later. "What's that? Plans," Walter said. "For this place from 1987. He handed the blueprint up to Caleb. The man who owned this diner drew these up right before it closed. He was trying to save it. Caleb studied the plans with the careful focus of someone reading a financial document, tracing the lines, understanding the spatial logic. He had his father's eye for how things should flow, even if the language was architecture rather than accounting. "These are good," he said. "They're very good." "Are we going to use them, Sam?" Walter stood up. He took the blueprint from Caleb, folded it carefully along its original creases, and placed it on the counter where he could see it while he worked. "We're going to finish what he started," he said. The jukebox was in the corner nearest the restrooms, covered by a canvas tarp that had gone stiff with age and the accumulated grime of decades. Walter pulled the tarp away and stepped back. It was a Wurlitzer early 1960s chrome and colored glass, with the curved elegance of that era's industrial design, the period when American manufacturers still believed that a machine should look like it was worth the money, that beauty and function were not competing values but complementary ones. The glass was dusty but uncracked. The chrome was tarnished but intact. Visible through the curved front window, records sat in their slots undisturbed, waiting with the same patience the rest of the building had been practicing for 37 years. It took most of an afternoon and 2 trips to Silas Webb's hardware store, a narrow storefront squeezed between 2 empty buildings, its inventory suggesting time had not moved much inside it, which in this case was exactly what they needed to find the right replacement belt in a needle that fit. Silas himself emerged from the back of the store with a box of old belts and a collection of needles and said he'd been holding on to them for 30 years, figuring somebody would need them eventually. He said it the way men say things they've been patient about for a long time and are now quietly satisfied to have their patience vindicated. Walter gave him $5 for the lot, and Silas looked pleased in the way that men are pleased when something they saved turns out to have been worth saving. Back at the diner, Walter and Caleb disassembled the mechanism completely, laying each piece on a clean cloth in the order it came on so they would know exactly where everything went when it came time to reassemble. Cleaning every electrical contact with fine sandpaper, checking each gear for damage, testing the spring tension on the mechanical selector. The work required the kind of patience that can't be performed. It either exists in you or it doesn't, and no amount of determination can substitute for it. Walter had it. He had developed it over decades on job sites, learning through hard experience that the difference between a good result and a catastrophic failure was usually the willingness to go slowly when everything in you wanted to move faster. Caleb took notes as they worked. When to tighten, when to leave slack, how the mechanical arm should sit in its rest position, what the belt tension should feel like when it was right. He had started keeping a notebook somewhere around the second day in the diner, and it had evolved from a simple list of repairs into something more comprehensive, a record of what they'd done, and increasingly a set of ideas about what the space might be if someone were willing to think about it that way. By late afternoon, they were ready to test the machine. Walter selected a record without looking at the label. He pressed the button. Nothing happened. He checked the connections, adjusted the belt tension, tried again. Nothing. Then the motor hummed, low tentative feeling its way back into the habit of motion. The arm moved. The record lifted and settled on the turntable with the careful deliberation of a machine that takes its responsibilities seriously, and the needle found its groove. And Sam Cooke's voice filled the Millstone Diner for the first time in 37 years, warm and unhurried and completely undiminished by the decades, as if the music had simply been waiting in the grooves of the record, patient and intact for someone to come along and release it. Walter and Caleb stood very still. The sound was scratchy at the edges, the way old records are, but underneath the scratching was something clean and strong, and it moved through the empty diner the way light moves through a room when the curtains are finally open after a long time. Caleb started laughing, real laughter without effort or self-consciousness, the kind that comes when something is so unexpected and so right that the body responds before the mind can get in the way, before the part of you that has learned to be careful can intervene. Walter felt his chest loosen, something he had been carrying without fully knowing he was carrying it. The front door opened. Dorothy Mercer stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth. She had been crossing the street when the music reached her, when the first bars of Sam Cooke had come through the gaps in the plywood and found her on the sidewalk and stopped her mid-step. She walked into the diner like someone entering a church, slow, careful, her eyes moving around the room as if she was seeing something beyond the walls. "I heard it from across the street," she said quietly. "I heard the music." Sam Cooke finished. Walter selected another record, and this time it was Patsy Cline, and Dorothy closed her eyes and swayed very slightly and said with her eyes still closed, "Stanley and I danced to this, right here in this room. It was raining outside, and we were the only ones in the place, and Mr. Marsh put this song on himself just for us. I haven't heard it in 20 years." She began to dance alone in the empty space, her movements slow and sure. A woman of 70 dancing with the memory of a man 10 years gone in a building that had been silent since before most of the people who would eventually fill it again had thought to care about it. Walter watched her and understood something he had not been able to articulate before. They had done more than repair a machine. They had opened a door. Word traveled through Crestfall, the way word always travels in a small town, not through phones or social media, but through the oldest channel there is, which is one person telling another person something worth knowing because they want them to know it because the news is too good to keep. By evening, Earl had come, and Agnes Whitfield with her husband and Gideon Doyle, the handyman who had brought plumbing parts 2 days earlier, and stayed to help. Roy Harmon arrived, 92 years old, Korean War veteran, moving with the deliberate dignity of a man who has earned every year and knows it, and with him 3 men of similar vintage, all of them residents of a town that had given them very little to look forward to recently. They gathered around the jukebox. They took turns selecting songs. Each song opened a story. Each story connected to others the way conversations do, when people finally have something worth talking about, when the dam breaks and what comes out is not just the present, but everything that's been building behind it. Roy Harmon talked about dancing at the diner in 1958 with a girl who eventually became his wife of 50 years, how he'd been so nervous He'd asked her for a second dance before the first one was properly finished. Earl talked about the booth where he had sat with Eleanor on the night he finally understood he was going to spend his life with her, how she'd ordered pee and talked for 3 hours, and he'd sat there thinking, this is what it's supposed to feel like. This is what people mean when they talk about knowing. Agnes, who had been watchful and restrained when Walter first met her, talked about her father bringing her here for pie every Friday after school, which was the only thing she looked forward to all week during a childhood that had otherwise been difficult, in ways she still didn't talk about directly. Caleb sat at the counter with his notebook writing. Not repairs this time. Walter could see it from across the room. Caleb was sketching booth arrangements, calculating rough estimates of supply costs, mapping the flow from kitchen to dining room, working out the numbers with the quiet focus of an accountant who has found a problem worth solving. He had been doing this for days quietly, not showing the work to Walter, waiting perhaps for some signal that it was safe to hope out loud, that hoping out loud wouldn't be punished by another collapse. Walter moved through the gathering, listening more than speaking. He refilled cups with the coffee the percolator kept making, patient and reliable in its corner. He watched the faces of people who had walked through this town for years with nowhere to put what they were feeling, the accumulated weight of watching a place you loved diminish by degrees. They had been carrying it alone, each of them, and now they were somewhere together, and the music was playing, and the carrying was lighter. Dorothy found him by the kitchen door near the end of the evening. "You've given us something," she said. "This town has been losing things for 30 years. You've given us something back." "It's just a jukebox," Walter said. "No," she said. "It's not. It's proof that things worth saving can be saved, that someone can walk into something broken and bring it back." She looked at him steadily with the directness of a woman who has spent 40 years saying true things to people who needed to hear them. Don't underestimate what that means to people who had stopped believing it. After everyone left, Walter and Caleb sat alone at the counter in the quiet that follows a room full of people, that particular quality of silence that is not empty, but full, that holds the shape of the conversation that just ended. "They care about this place," Caleb said. "They do." Caleb opened his notebook to a page dense with small, careful handwriting. He turned it to face his father. Walter looked at it for a longer time. Menu ideas organized by category and cost. Operating expenses estimated line by line with the precision of a man who has worked with numbers his whole adult life and understands that the difference between a business that survives and one that doesn't is usually in the details that optimists overlook. Revenue projections kept deliberately modest, built on conservative assumptions. Days and hours calibrated to what the kitchen could actually produce with the staff they had. At the top of the page, in larger letters than the rest, Millstone Diner Operating Plan Draft 1. "Your grandfather would have liked you," Walter said. Caleb looked up. He didn't talk much, but he had good judgment about people, about what was real and what wasn't. Walter looked at the toolbox sitting on the floor near the kitchen door, the red metal catching the light. "He would have liked you." Caleb was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "When do we tell people we're thinking about actually opening this place?" "When we're sure enough to say it out loud," Walter said. "When saying it out loud doesn't feel like tempting fate." Outside, Crestfall slept. The wind had died down and the street was still, and the old banner from 2022 hung across Main Street in the cold air, patient, as the building had been patient, waiting for someone to notice it was still there, or waiting for someone to finally take it down. Walter locked the door and walked back through the diner, turning off lights one by one. He stopped at the counter and stood in the dark for a moment, looking at Harold Marsh's blueprint, spread out on the surface, the careful lines of a man's intention preserved in ink. He thought about a man in 1987 who had tried to find a way through a winter that turned out to be longer than any winter he had planned for. He thought about his father. He thought about the note still tucked beneath the liner of the toolbox in the dark. "Crane men build. They don't run." He picked up the flashlight and went to find his sleeping bag. Tomorrow there was work to do. There is a particular kind of momentum that builds when people decide without anyone announcing it that something matters. It doesn't start with meetings or plans or any formal declaration of intent. It starts with someone showing up. Then someone else who heard from the first and thought, well, if they're going, I should go. Then a third person who heard from the second, and a fourth who saw the lights on from the street and figured they'd better come see what was happening before it was over. It starts small and quiet and moves at the pace of human beings making ordinary decisions about how to spend their time. And then one morning you look up from what you're doing and the room is full of people, and you can't remember exactly when that happened or how, only that it did. That was how the second week at the Millstone Diner began. Gideon Doyle arrived on a Monday morning with a truck bed full of pipe fittings and didn't ask permission. He was 52, thick through the shoulders, with the hands of a man who had spent 3 decades fixing things that other people had given up on, hands that knew their work the way musicians know their instruments. He had worked every trade in Crestfall at one point or another because, in a town this small, a man who could fix things fixed everything, and the alternative was watching things stay broken. He walked through the diner, assessed the plumbing situation with the professional silence of someone who communicates primarily through results, and spent the next 2 days under sinks and behind walls replacing what needed replacing and reinforcing what could be saved with the patient thoroughness of a man who takes pride in a work that will outlast the current emergency. He didn't talk much while he worked, but at the end of the second day, when the water ran clear and hot from every faucet and the pressure held steady at every outlet, he wiped his hands on a rag and looked at Walter with something that was as close to satisfaction as his face seemed to allow. "Kitchen's serviceable," he said. "Old Harold kept good pipes, just needed attention." He accepted a cup of coffee and left without discussing payment in the manner of a man who considers some debts to be owed to the place rather than to the person. The students came on Wednesday. Margaret Briggs was the principal of Crestfall High School, a woman in her late 40s who had spent 15 years watching the town's population decline and as children leave for places that could offer them more watching. The school's enrollment numbers fall with the slow inevitability of water finding its level. She arrived with 11 students and a van full of cleaning supplies, and she organized them with the efficiency of someone who had learned that teenagers perform better when given specific tasks and clear standards rather than vague encouragement and ambient supervision. They descended on the Millstone Diner like a focused storm. Floors scrubbed tile by tile with the thoroughness of people who have been told exactly what done looks like. Windows washed inside and out until the light coming through them was clean and honest. The kind of light that makes you see a room as it actually is rather than as you've gotten used to it being. Booths wiped down their cracked vinyl, cleaned and treated with conditioner someone had thought to bring. The photographs along the far wall removed one by one, their frames cleaned of decades of accumulated grime, the images themselves preserved behind glass that could now be seen clearly for the first time in a very long time. Walter worked alongside them doing the structural things while they handled the surfaces, and he watched them work with something he hadn't felt in a long time. These were kids who had grown up in a town that had been telling them for their entire lives in 100 small ways that things here didn't get better, that the trajectory was one direction only, that the best thing to do was to prepare to leave. And here they were on their hands and knees, cleaning a floor in a building that had been abandoned since before their parents were out of high school. They weren't doing it because someone graded them on it. They were doing it because someone had shown them it was possible. And when you show young people that something is possible, they respond with an earnestness that their elders have often lost. Margaret found Walter in the kitchen mid-afternoon, leaning against the range with his arms crossed, watching through the pass-through window. "They've never done anything like this before," she said quietly. "Worked on something for the town. There's never been anything for them to work on, nothing that felt like it could actually change." She looked at the students in the dining room, at the way they moved with a seriousness that hadn't been there at the start of the morning. "You've shown them that caring about something isn't naive." Walter didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which is often the right response to something true. Roy Harmon came on Thursday with 3 men. They were all of a similar vintage, men in their late 80s and early 90s who moved with the careful deliberation of age, but held themselves with a straightness that came from somewhere other than habit, from a discipline installed long ago and maintained ever since. Roy introduced them by their service branches rather than their names, which was its own kind of introduction, and they set to work building a serving station near the kitchen pass-through. A structure of wood salvaged from materials Gideon had left behind, measured and cut and assembled with the economy of men who had learned long ago that unnecessary motion was a waste of what little time remained. By the end of the day, the station was solid, functional, exactly right. Roy looked at it for a moment with the evaluating eye of a craftsman checking his own work. Then he looked at Walter. Harold Marsh used to save us the counter stools on Friday afternoons, Roy said. After the mill shift ended, 7, 8 of us, sometimes more. Coffee was always fresh and always ready. He was quiet for a moment. We'd sit there for 2, 3 hours, didn't talk about anything important mostly. Jobs, weather, kids. The ordinary things. Just sat together. Another pause longer this time. You don't know what that means until you don't have it anymore. You don't understand what it was holding until it's gone, and you're holding it yourself without anywhere to put it. Walter understood. Nora Keene came on a Friday evening after her shift at the county hospital, still in her scrubs carrying a coffee thermos and a yellow legal pad. She was 29, with dark circles under her eyes from 12 hours of nursing and the particular alertness of someone who has learned to function well on too little sleep, whose body has adapted to the demands placed on it. She was Margaret Briggs's younger sister, and she had the same directness as Margaret, but deployed differently, not administrative but clinical. The directness of someone trained to assess a situation quickly and tell you exactly what it is without softening it into something more comfortable but less true. She sat with Caleb at the counter and looked at his notebook. She didn't ask polite questions about his plans. She asked real ones. What was the expected per-table revenue on a Saturday morning with full occupancy? How were they managing food cost against expected volume given the limitations of a two-person kitchen? What was the contingency plan if the first weekend's turnout was lower than projected? And had he projected multiple scenarios or just the optimistic one? Caleb answered each question carefully, sometimes pausing mid-answer to recalculate, sometimes crossing out a number and writing a better one as he talked through it with her. Walter watched from the kitchen doorway, pretending to be busy with something else, and noticed that his son sat up slightly differently when Nora was in the room. Not performance, something more honest than that. The way a person sits when they want to be taken seriously by someone whose opinion has already begun to matter before they fully understand why. Opening day was set, Friday the 1st of December, 2024. 3 weeks away. They worked every day. Walter moved through the repairs in order of priority, following Harold Marsh's blueprint, the way a surgeon follows a procedure, not improvising, not skipping steps, because they seemed less urgent than the step after them, trusting the intelligence of the plan, even when a particular step seemed like it could be postponed. Harold had thought this through carefully. He had understood the building in a way that only long familiarity produces. Walter had learned over 30 years that the man who drew the plans was usually right about things the man doing the work but was tempted to cut corners on. In the evenings when the light was gone and the day's work was done, the diner filled up briefly with whoever had come by Earl with news from the town, Dorothy, with food and questions, Agnes, occasionally Gideon stopping in to check on what he'd repaired. It had begun to feel less like a building they were occupying and more like a place they were responsible for. The difference mattered. Responsibility is what you feel towards something you care about. Occupation is what you feel towards something you're using until something better comes along. Walter felt responsible. He hadn't felt responsible for anything good in over a year. He had spent a year feeling responsible for things going wrong, which is a different thing, entirely heavier, with no constructive outlet. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 8 days before the opening. Earl brought it over from the post office in the early afternoon, a plain white envelope addressed to Walter Crane, care of Millstone Diner, Crestfall, Kentucky. The return address was in Nashville, Tennessee. The name above it was Bartholomew Ellison. Walter stared at the name for a moment before opening the envelope. Bart Ellison had worked for Crane Construction for 11 years. He had started as a laborer, young and willing, but still learning, and had become one of Walter's most reliable foremen over the course of a decade, the kind of man you trusted with complicated jobs, because he combined real technical skill with the steadiness of someone who had learned not to panic when things went wrong, and things always went wrong on construction sites. When the company collapsed, Walter had called each of his 23 employees personally. He had considered having his lawyer do it or sending letters, but in the end, he couldn't bring himself to deliver that news any way other than directly. Bart had listened without interrupting, asked a few practical questions, thanked Walter for the call, and said he'd land on his feet. Walter had believed him, had hoped for it. He opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter on plain paper, 2 pages in Bart's large, careful handwriting. the handwriting of a man who had not written much by hand before smartphones and had developed his own deliberate script. Folded into the letter was a check for $500. Walter sat down on a stool at the counter and read, "Mr. Crane, I saw the piece the Crestfall paper ran online about at the diner. A friend in Kentucky forwarded it to me, figured I'd want to know. I've been following things from a distance since last year more than you probably know. I want to say something I should have said when you called me. You gave me 11 years of honest work. You paid fair wages and you kept your word every single time you gave it, and in this business, that is rarer than it should be. When you made me a foreman, you told me you weren't promoting me because of my skills. You said skills were common. You were promoting me because I treated the other men right. I've thought about that a lot in the years since. What happened with that investment deal was not a failure of your character. I know you. I know the difference. A man who gets taken by a con isn't weak. He's someone who extended trust and got it used against him. That happens to good men. It doesn't change what kind of man you are. The check is not charity. It's back pay on a debt that can't actually be calculated. You gave me 11 years of honest work and never once made me feel small. A man like that doesn't stay down. I know you'll build something good wherever you are. Bart Ellison." Walter read the letter twice. He set it down on the counter and looked at it for a while without reading it again. He was not looking at the words. He was looking at what the words represented, which was something he had not understood until this moment. He sat alone with it for a long time. 11 years. He had 23 employees at the height of crane construction, men and women he had hired and trained, and he had always believed treated right. When the company collapsed, he had been consumed by the accounting of it, the money lost, the contracts left unfinished, the debts that couldn't be paid. He had counted everything in financial terms because that was the most obvious thing to count in the thing that showed up in the courthouse records and the bank statements. He had not counted this. He had not counted what remained in the people he had worked with, the 11 years of showing up honest, the wages paid in full every single time, the promotions given for the right reasons, the phone calls made personally when everything ended because he owed them at least that. He had thought of all of that as basic decency, the minimum that any decent employer would do, and he had never considered that it might be a form of building. But it was. Crane construction was gone. The accounts were empty. The permits had been fraudulent. The assets liquidated the name filed in courthouse records as a failed entity. And Bart Ellison had been walking around Nashville for a year with 11 years of honest work inside him that Walter had given him, that Walter had actually built, that no con man and no bankruptcy and no catastrophic failure of judgment had been able to take away. Walter sat with that for a long time. He thought about the note in the bottom of the toolbox. The work is what you're made of. He had understood it when he first read it as instruction, as something pointing forward. But sitting here with Bart's letter in his hands, he understood it also as something pointing backward. The work you had already done. The work that was already built. The work that lived in other people and could not be repossessed. He hadn't failed everything. He had failed a business. Those were two different things, and he had spent a year treating them as the same thing. He folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the blueprint on the counter. Two pieces of paper that meant more than their combined weight suggested possible. He was still sitting there when Caleb came back from the hardware store that afternoon. "What's that?" Caleb asked, setting down his bag. Walter picked up the letter and held it out. Caleb read it carefully, his expression shifting as he went, and when he finished, he looked up at his father with something that was neither pity nor relief, but closer to recognition. "You didn't fail everything," Caleb said. "You know that." "I'm starting to," Walter said. That night, long after the diner had gone quiet and the last of the visitors had gone home, Walter and Caleb sat together at the counter with coffee that had been sitting too long and was bitter at the edges the way coffee gets when it's been keeping company with itself for hours. Neither of them had planned to have this conversation. It came the way real conversations come, not when you're ready for them, not when the conditions are ideal, but when the conditions finally permit them, when the silence has been earned and the ground is ready. "I want to say something," Caleb said. Walter waited. "When you showed me the paperwork for the Reed deal, when you asked me to invest." Caleb held his coffee mug in both hands, looking at it rather than at his father. "I saw things that didn't add up. The The timeline moved too fast for a legitimate development project. I'd done enough financial modeling to know that. The permit documentation was thinner than it should have been. There were inconsistencies in the projected revenue figures that would have flagged immediately in any due diligence process. Walter said nothing. I didn't say anything because I told myself you knew better than me. You'd been in business for 25 years. I'd been out of college for 4. Who was I to question your judgment about a deal you'd already made? Caleb set the mug down. But that wasn't the real reason. He looked at his father. The real reason is that I wanted to believe. You were so certain about it, so hopeful. I hadn't seen you that hopeful about anything in years. You'd been grinding for so long, and suddenly you had this thing you were excited about. And I didn't want to be the one to take that away from you. I wanted to be your partner, not your critic. I wanted you to see me as someone who trusted your judgment. He paused. So I stayed quiet, and then everything went wrong. And I spent the next 8 months being angry at you when I was just as responsible for the decision as you were. More responsible maybe because I had the specific professional knowledge to see what you didn't. The diner was very still around them. Walter looked at his son for a long time, at the jaw that was his mother's, and the eyes that were his own, at the face that was built for honesty and had just demonstrated it in the most difficult way. I made you feel like doubt was betrayal, he said finally. I know I did. I've been doing that your whole life, projecting a certainty I didn't always have, making it feel dangerous to push back on me, creating an atmosphere where disagreement felt like disloyalty. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. If you couldn't question me about the deal that's on me, I built those conditions. I'm the one who should have made it safe for you to say what you saw. You didn't force me to. No. But I created conditions where it felt costly. That's a thing a father can do without meaning to, without ever having a single conversation about it. And it cost you. He set the mug down. I'm sorry for that. Specifically for that. Not just for the deal. Caleb was quiet for a moment, processing this. We both made the same mistake, he said finally. We both wanted it to be true badly enough that we didn't look hard enough at whether it was. We did. So we don't do that again. Whatever comes next, we look at it honestly. Both of us say what we see. Agreed, Walter said. They sat together in the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the silence of two people who have finally said what needed saying and are resting in the space the saying has cleared. Outside, the wind moved through Crestfall. Inside, the old building settled around them, patient and unhurried, the way it had been for 37 years. The lawyer arrived on a Wednesday morning, 10 days before the opening. He was in his late 40s, well-dressed in a way that was clearly intentional, not ostentatious but precise, the way men dress when they want their appearance to communicate something about their authority before they speak. He was carrying a leather briefcase that had been chosen for the same reason. His name was Preston Cole, and he introduced himself at the door with the practiced calm of a man who has delivered unwelcome news many times and has learned that the most efficient approach is a neutral affect and direct language. Walter saw him park the sedan from the kitchen window and knew before the man knocked that whatever was coming was not good. There is a particular quality to the arrival of certain kinds of news, a weight in the atmosphere that precedes it, the way the air changes before weather. They sat in a booth. Preston Cole set his briefcase on the table, and removed a folder without ceremony. I represent Raymond Marsh, he said, the nephew of Harold Marsh, the original proprietor of this property. He slid a document across the table. Mrs. Evelyn Marsh, Harold's widow, has been under a misapprehension regarding her ownership of this property since Harold's death in 2003. The property passed into a family trust at that time, the terms of which Evelyn was apparently never fully explained. There has been a dispute among the heirs for the past 8 years. Walter looked at the document. The words moved on the page. That dispute was resolved 3 weeks ago through litigation. Raymond Marsh is the legal owner of this property. Preston Cole's voice remained neutral, not unkind, but professionally distant, the affect of a man who has learned to deliver facts without editorializing. Mrs. Evelyn Marsh had no legal authority to grant you permission to occupy the premises. That permission, however well-intentioned, is void. Caleb's voice came from beside Walter, steady in a way Walter was grateful for. She believed she owned it. She did believe that. She was mistaken. Preston Cole folded his hands on the table. Mr. Marsh has a pending sale agreement with a regional development firm. The agreed price is $200,000. The sale is expected to close within 30 days. He looked at Walter. You'll need to vacate the property. Mr. Marsh is prepared to offer you 2 weeks to make arrangements. Walter looked at the document in front of him. He had looked at a lot of documents in his life. Contracts, permits, loan agreements, the final accounting of a company he had built over 25 years. He had signed things he should have read more carefully, and he had read things that told him nothing useful until it was too late. He looked at this document and understood it completely and felt the floor of the moment give way beneath him, not dramatically, not with any sound, but in the particular way that ground gives way when what you've been standing on turns out not to have been solid. Is there any legal basis for us to remain? Caleb asked. None, Preston Cole said. You've occupied the property without a lease, without paying rent, without any formal agreement with the rightful owner. You have no legal claim. After the lawyer left, they sat in the booth for a long time without speaking. The diner was quiet around them. The afternoon light came through the windows they had spent days cleaning, honest and clear. The counter they had sanded together gleamed in the low November sun. Harold Marsh's blueprint lay spread at the kitchen end of the counter, where Walter had been consulting it that morning, the plans of a man who had run out of time, which now had company. The opening, Caleb said finally. I know. Everything people have donated, the supplies, the time they put in. He stopped. I know, Walter said again. There was nothing else to say yet. Sometimes you have to sit with a thing before you can think about what to do with it. Walter sat with it. He had spent the last year learning how to sit with things that couldn't be immediately fixed, and that was perhaps the one useful skill the collapse of crane construction had given him. The patience to stay in the difficult place until something clarified. He sat. The diner sat around him. The community meeting that evening was not planned. Word traveled the way word traveled in Crestfall, through Agnes at the grocery store, through Earl at the post office, through a phone call from Dorothy to Gideon, through Roy telling his friends in the particular way that men of his generation relay important news, which is without embellishment but with full gravity. By 7 o'clock, the diner was full. Earl, Dorothy, Agnes, Gideon, Roy, and his friends Margaret Briggs, three of the students who had spent a week cleaning the place, Silas Webb from the hardware store, a handful of people Walter recognized from the evenings around the jukebox, and others he was seeing for the first time, people who had heard something was happening and wanted to be present for it. Walter told them what Preston Cole had told him. He said it plainly without softening it or framing it in ways designed to make it easier to hear. $200,000. 30 days. No legal basis to remain. The development company's plans were not something Preston Cole had specified, but the phrase regional development firm covered a range of possibilities, and none of them involved the Millstone Diner continuing to exist in any form that the people in this room would recognize. The room absorbed this. The silence that followed had weight and texture. Then Silas Webb said, "What if we buy it?" $200,000, Caleb said carefully. We have $8,300 in the donation jar as of this afternoon. The number settled over the room like something physical. Roy Harmon's hand came down on the table, not quite a slam, but carrying the weight of a man who has not been patient for 92 years by being passive. So we're just going to walk away. Let them tear it down and put up another. Roy. Dorothy Mercer's voice was quiet, but it cut through. She stood slowly. Dorothy Mercer, at 70, had a presence that came from 40 years of managing rooms full of people who didn't want to listen, who were distracted or resistant or frightened or simply young. She stood and the room went quiet, and she let the quiet sit for a moment before she spoke into it. We cannot buy this building with what we have, she said. That's true. And we cannot change the legal situation. And we cannot make Raymond Marsh into a different kind of man than he is. She looked around the room, meeting people's eyes one at a time. But we can decide how this story ends. No one spoke. There are people in this room who cleaned that kitchen and those windows, who carried pipe fittings in the back of a truck, who built that serving station, who brought food and coffee and sat around that jukebox and remembered for the first time in years what this town used to feel like. She paused, letting it land. None of that goes away because a lawyer came with a folder. None of that was conditional on whether we get to keep the building. That happened. It is real. It is ours. She looked at Walter. "We open on December 1st," she said. "As planned. One day, one full day, exactly what we've been preparing for. Not because it changes the outcome, because it is the right way to end something worth ending well. Because we refuse to let this place close without being seen one more time as what it was." The room was still. Then Earl Hutchins said quietly, "She's right," and the room moved. Late that night, after everyone had left with renewed purpose and specific tasks for the days ahead, Walter sat alone. He had sent Caleb to get some sleep. He needed the quiet, and Caleb had understood and gone without argument. They had reached the point in their partnership where certain things didn't require explanation. The diner held its silence around him. The kitchen was clean and organized, a week's worth of careful preparation visible in the arrangement of every surface. The dining room was ready in the way that a room is ready when the work has been done properly. The jukebox waited in its corner. Harold Marsh's blueprint lay on the counter. Walter picked up the old guest book. He had been meaning to read through it more carefully since he first found it, a leather-bound volume in a cabinet beneath the counter. Its pages yellowed and fragile, covering the years from 1952 to the diner's closing in October 1987. He had leafed through it briefly that first week, but the days had been full, and there had always been something more immediately pressing than the past. Tonight, there was nothing more pressing. He opened it at the beginning, 1952, and began to read. The entries were what you'd expect from a place like this, short ordinary, the handwriting of people who didn't think of themselves as writers, but wanted to put something down anyway. Wanted to say I was here and it mattered. Anniversaries, birthdays, traveling salesmen passing through who wanted to note that the pie was worth the stop. Families making memories they didn't know yet were memories. The texture of a community's daily life preserved in ink that had faded from black to brown and then to something approaching gold. He read for an hour. He turned the pages, carefully aware that what he was holding was irreplaceable, not because of any material value, but because of what it contained. The record of people deciding that a moment was worth noting, that they had been somewhere that mattered, that they wanted to leave evidence of it. He was somewhere in the middle of 1961 when he stopped. The entry was unremarkable in its appearance. Third from the top of a page dated June 1961, between an anniversary celebration from a couple named Fletcher and a note from someone called May, who said the hash browns were the best she'd had this side of the Mississippi. The handwriting was familiar. Walter had grown up with that handwriting on birthday cards, on notes left on the kitchen counter, on the bottom of the tool inventory list his father kept in the workshop in the evenings. William Crane passing through Crestfall. Best coffee in Kentucky. June 14th, 1961. Walter sat very still. His father had been 29 years old in June of 1961. Walter had not yet been born. He would not arrive until 1970. William Crane had been a young man passing through Kentucky on some job or some errand that had brought him down Route 9 and into Crestfall and into this diner. He had sat where at the counter in a booth. He had ordered coffee. He had found it worth writing down. He had sat in this building, at this counter, on these stools, in this same air, looking at these same walls 63 years before Walter sat looking at them now. His father had been in this room, had breathed this air, had sat somewhere in the space that Walter was sitting in, and had thought, this is good coffee, this is worth remembering. Walter did not call for Caleb. He did not say anything aloud. He sat with the guest book in his lap and the diner around him in the November night outside and felt something in his chest that he did not have a precise word for. It was not grief. It was not happiness. It was something that encompassed both the way certain landscapes encompass contradictions, the way a place can be beautiful and broken at the same time, and the beauty is not diminished by the brokenness, but made more real by it because the brokenness is what the beauty has survived. His father had been here. His father had sat in this room and drunk coffee and found it worth noting, and then he had passed through and moved on with his life, and 63 years later, his son was sitting in the same room trying to decide whether it was worth saving. Walter sat with that for a long time. Then he stood up. He placed the guest book carefully on the counter, open to the June 1961 page, and looked at his father's handwriting for another moment. Then he went to the kitchen. He had been working on the cinnamon roll recipe for 3 days, his father's recipe reconstructed from memory, and from a partial conversation he half remembered from when he was about 12 watching William Crane bake on a Christmas morning and trying to memorize the proportions without understanding why it mattered to him. Walter had not made them in 20 years. The first attempt had burned. The second had been too dense. The gluten overdeveloped the rolls heavy and flat where they should have been light. The third had been close but not quite right, something off in the balance. He was going to get it right tonight. He measured the flour. He warmed the milk to exactly the right temperature. The temperature his father had described once as warm enough that it doesn't feel cold on your wrist. He proofed the yeast and watched it bloom with the patient anticipation of someone who has learned that you can't hurry yeast any more than you can hurry certain other things. He worked the butter in with his hands, feeling the dough change as it absorbed it, the texture shifting from rough to smooth to something that had a life to it that wanted to be shaped. He worked in silence, and the work opened space in his mind, the way physical work always had, the way his father had said it would. He thought about William Crane's handwriting in the June 1961 guest book. He thought about Harold Marsh drawing a blueprint in July of 1987, writing that single line in pencil at the bottom, "If I can get through this winter, I can save this place." He thought about Bart Ellison in Nashville carrying 11 years of honest work inside him like something that could not be taken. He thought about Caleb on the first night in this building, sitting on the sleeping bag on the floor or eating cold soup from a can, saying nothing, holding his anger quietly because he was trying to figure out how to keep being his father's son when his father had led him to a floor in an abandoned diner in a dying town. The dough was ready. He rolled it out on the clean counter. He spread the butter with a spoon, then the cinnamon and sugar, working it to the edges with a care that would not have been visible to anyone watching, but was present in every motion in the deliberateness of each stroke. He rolled it tight and cut it clean and arranged the pieces in the pan and covered them and put them in the cold to rise overnight. He cleaned the kitchen. He turned off the lights. He stood in the dark for a moment, looking through the pass-through window at the dining room, at the guest book, open on the counter, at Harold Marsh's blueprint, weighted at its corners. Then he went to sleep. Outside Crestfall held its breath in the November cold. 11 days until December 1st. He was in the kitchen by 4 in the morning. He had not slept well, but it was not the sleeplessness of dread, not the kind of wakefulness that holds you in place and won't let you move forward. It was the sleeplessness of a man who has too much to do and not enough hours, which is an entirely different condition, one that pulls you forward rather than holding you down. Walter had learned the difference in the last 2 weeks. He had spent a year being held down. He knew what that felt like. This was not that. He lit the oven. He checked the cinnamon rolls he had left to rise overnight, lifting the cloth, carefully examining the dough with the same focused attention he gave to everything. They had risen properly. Even in the cold of the kitchen, they had done what good dough does when it is made right, expanded slowly, unhurried, filling the space available to them without force or urgency. He put them in the oven and set the timer. Then he started the coffee. 2 commercial-grade percolators running simultaneously because Earl Hutchins had donated a second one he'd found in a storage unit he was clearing, and between them they could keep the diner in fresh coffee for the entire day if Walter managed the timing correctly. The smell of coffee in the morning is one of the few smells that functions as a complete sentence. It says, "This place is open and someone is here, you are expected, come in." Walter wanted that smell reaching the street before anyone arrived. He wanted it to be the first thing people encountered before they saw the door, before they heard the jukebox. He worked through his mise en place the way he had practiced every day for the past week until the sequence was automatic. Eggs organized by the flat, butter cut and portioned, potatoes already shredded and pressed dry in clean towels, the preparation for hash browns that had to happen the night before a lesson he'd relearned, through 2 batches that were too wet and came out soft instead of crisp. Bacon laid in rows on the sheet trays ready for the oven. Pancake batter mixed to the right consistency and rested overnight in the cooler. Everything in its place. Every motion already mapped. Harold Marsh's blueprint was on the wall. Walter had pinned it there 2 days ago, not because he still needed to reference it. He had long since internalized every measurement, every decision it recorded, but because it belonged there. It was part of what this kitchen was. Harold had imagined it. Walter had built it. Those 2 facts were not separate. They were the same story told in 2 chapters by 2 men who had never met. The timer went off. He pulled the cinnamon rolls from the oven. They were perfect. He knew they were perfect before he touched them, from the color and the rise and the way the edges had set pulling slightly from the sides of the pan in the way that properly risen dough does when it's been baked correctly. He made the cream cheese frosting while they were still hot, spreading it carefully so it melted into the warm dough and became part of it rather than sitting on top like an afterthought. The smell that came off them was the smell of his father's kitchen on Christmas morning, of cold winter air and warm indoor light of a time before things got complicated in the ways that adult life complicates everything. He stood in the kitchen alone with the smell of it and allowed himself for exactly one moment to feel how much he wished his father could be here. To be standing in this kitchen that smelled like William Crane's Christmas morning in a building his father had once sat in and drunk coffee and found worth noting. One moment, then he moved on. There was work to do. Caleb came down at 6:30, already dressed, his notebook in his hand. He looked at the kitchen, at the organized stations, the covered trays, the rolls cooling on the rack, the two percolators doing their patient work, and he stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything, taking it in. "Coffee's ready," Walter said. Caleb poured a cup and stood at the pass-through window looking out at the dining room. Dorothy Mercer and Nora Keene were already there, having let themselves in through the back with the key Walter had given them. Dorothy was moving through the dining room with the methodical focus of a woman who has organized many events and understands that the difference between a good one and a great one is in the details no one will consciously notice, but everyone will feel. She was straightening silverware, adjusting the placement of mugs, checking each booth one last time. Nora was at the serving station reviewing the order system she and Caleb had designed together, tracing the workflow, with her finger checking it against some internal standard. "She's good," Caleb said quietly, watching her. "I know," Walter said. Caleb turned back to his coffee. "You ready for this?" he asked. Walter looked at the kitchen around him, at the organized surfaces and the waiting trays and the blueprint on the wall and the two percolators running and the cinnamon rolls cooling in their perfect rows and the morning light beginning to come through the window above the sink. "I've been ready for this my whole life," he said. "I just didn't know what it was going to look like." Earl Hutchins arrived at 7:55. He was wearing a black suit that had last seen service at a funeral several years ago, pressed carefully and showing the slight shine of fabric that has been ironed many times over many years. His shoes were polished. His white shirt was buttoned to the collar with the care of a man who understands that certain occasions require certain things from you all. He had combed his hair with a precision that suggested the comb had been employed with deliberate, unhurried care. He stood at the door and waited for it to be opened, because a gentleman waits to be received. Walter opened it. "First customer," Earl said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were doing something they didn't usually do, something that in a less reserved man would have been closer to the surface. "First and most welcome," Walter said. He stepped back, and Earl Hutchins walked into the Millstone Diner, the way a man walks into a church, not with performance, not with any self-consciousness about the gravity of the moment, but with the genuine weight of someone who understands that some thresholds are different from other thresholds. That some doors, when you walk through them, take you somewhere that matters. He sat at the third stool from the left, his stool. Walter brought him coffee without asking. Then the door opened again, and after that it didn't really close. Agnes Whitfield and her husband, who had driven in the back way to avoid the growing crowd. Gideon Doyle with his two grown sons, both of whom had driven from neighboring towns, both of whom had heard enough from their father to understand that this was worth the drive. Roy Harmon and four men from his Korean War veterans group, all of them in their dress uniforms, their chests carrying the organized weight of their decorations, not worn for display, but for respect for the marking of an occasion. Margaret Briggs was 7 of the students who had cleaned this place. They came through the door with the particular pride of people who have earned the right to be present at something by having helped build it. Silas Webb, who closed his hardware store for the first time on a weekday in 11 years, because some things are worth closing for. Families Walter had never met who had heard through the chain of small-town information that something worth seeing was happening on Main Street. People from 2 towns over who had read the piece in the Crestfall weekly paper that had been shared and reshared online until it found its way to people who had grown up in Crestfall and moved away and had spent years telling themselves they didn't miss it and had been waiting without knowing it for a reason to think differently. By 9 o'clock, every booth was full. Every stool at the counter was taken. People stood along the far wall, coffee in hand, talking to each other with the ease of people who have been given a good reason to be in the same place. The jukebox ran continuously. Dorothy had taken responsibility for it, selecting songs with the editorial judgment of someone who understood that music in a room is not decoration, but architecture, that it shapes the space it fills and determines what the space allows. The sound of the Millstone Diner at 9 o'clock on the 1st of December 2024 was the sound of 100 people who had forgotten what it felt like to be in the same place together suddenly remembering. Like a language they had learned and stopped speaking and discovered with the first sentence that they had never really forgotten. Walter cooked. He moved through his station with the precision and pace he had practiced, turning nothing out that wasn't right, composing each plate with the attention of someone who understands that what you put in front of a person is a statement about how you regard them. Scrambled eggs that were soft and creamy, finished with butter at the last moment. Hash browns pressed hard on the griddle until the edges went gold and crisp, the interior still yielding. Pancakes poured in measured circles, flipped at exactly the right moment. Bacon from the oven, each strip consistent. And cinnamon rolls plated one at a time, the frosting applied while they were still warm, so it melted into the dough. Through the pass-through window, in the intervals between calls, Walter could see what was happening in the room. Roy Harmon and Earl at the counter, their heads bent together in the posture of men exchanging important things that don't require volume. Margaret Briggs's students in a booth with the straight-backed focus of young people who understand they are witnessing something they will remember. Dorothy moving through the room, touching a shoulder here, pausing to listen, there her face carrying the expression of a woman who has been right about something for a long time and is watching the proof arrive. He could see Caleb. His son moved through the dining room with a calm authority that Walter recognized as genuine, not performed. Caleb knew where every order was in its sequence. He knew which tables needed refills before they asked. He knew how to manage the flow of a full room without making the management visible, without letting the machinery show. He had built a system, and the system was working, and he was running it with the ease of someone doing exactly what he is built to do in exactly the right place to do it. Walter watched his son and felt something that had no efficient name, a compound of pride and relief, and something older and deeper than either the particular feeling of a father who sees his child become fully unmistakably themselves, who sees the person you always believed they could be standing right there in front of you doing it. He turned back to his station. He had plates to make. The jar appeared on the counter sometime around 9:30. Walter didn't see who placed it. He was in the kitchen when it arrived, and when he next looked through the pass-through, it was simply there, a large glass jar with a handwritten card taped to it that said, "Save the Millstone Diner," in letters large enough to read from the booths. He watched through the window as people noticed it. Earl saw it first, pulled out his wallet without hesitation, folded bills, and pressed them through the opening with the deliberateness of a man making a considered decision. Agnes's husband reached across the counter and added to it. Roy Harmon and his veterans conferred briefly in the way men confer when they are about to do something together. Then Roy produced an envelope from the inside pocket of his dress uniform and placed it whole into the jar. Children were given bills by their parents and carried them up to the jar with the solemnity of small people who understand that they are participating in something important, even if they don't entirely know what it is. By 10 o'clock, the jar was more than half full. Walter turned back to his eggs. The man came in at 11:15. He sat in the corner booth, the one Dorothy had told Nora about, the one that held the long sediment of important moments. He was in his late 50s, well-dressed, without ostentation, with the weathered face of someone who spends time outdoors and the watchful eyes of someone accustomed to assessing situations before committing to them. He sat with his coat still on and ordered coffee when Dorothy came to the table. Dorothy brought it without ceremony. She did not know him, and she treated him as she treated every other person in the room, as someone who had come to the Millstone Diner and therefore deserved the full attention and care she had to offer, which was her understanding of what the diner required of its people. She poured his coffee and started to leave. "You've been here before," the man said. It was not quite a question. Dorothy turned back. "Many times," she said, "though not recently. It's been closed a long time." "What was it like before?" Dorothy looked at him for a moment with the evaluating gaze of a retired school teacher encountering an unexpected question, and then she sat down across from him in the booth, not waiting to be asked. because Dorothy Mercer had learned long ago that life is too short for unnecessary waiting. She told him about the booth, about a young man named Stanley who had been so nervous on their first date that he spilled his water twice, and how the waitress Betty had restored his dignity without making a production of it. About how Stanley had proposed at this same table 11 years later after all those years of being sure, and how the ring had been modest, but exactly right. About 50 years of marriage that had started in this booth, in this room, with coffee and pie and a conversation that had not wanted to end. The man across from her listened with the complete attention of someone who was hearing something they did not expect to need. Roy Harmon, finishing his second cup at the counter, noticed the booth and carried his coffee over. He settled in beside the man with the ease of someone who has never in 92 years met a stranger he couldn't talk to, and he began talking about the Millstone Diner, in the way he talked about the things that mattered to him directly, without preamble, as if the conversation had already been going on for a while, and he was simply joining it at the relevant point. He talked about the mill workers coming in after the morning shift, about the stools being warm all day, one man leaving, and another sitting down before the seat had time to cool. About Harold Marsh knowing not just your order, but your news, your family, what you were worried about, what you were proud of. About what happens to a town when the place where people gather disappears. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly. The connections fraying one by one until people who lived 3 blocks apart became strangers who had forgotten they had ever been anything else. You can't replace a place like this with something else, Roy said. You can put up another building. You can put in a chain restaurant or a coffee shop, whatever they're building now. People will go there, but it won't be the same. Because the same isn't about the food or the coffee. The same is about 30 years of shared history in the walls. You can't manufacture that. You can only lose it. The man said nothing for a long time. Then he stood up. He folded a 20 under his coffee cup. He looked at Dorothy and at Roy, and at the room full of people around him, at the jukebox playing in the corner, and the jar filling on the counter, and the students in the booth, and the veterans at the counter, and the children being lifted onto stools by their parents, and he walked out the front door without introducing himself. Walter had watched all of this through the pass-through window. He was still watching when the man came around through the back entrance 15 minutes later and found Walter in the kitchen. "Mr. Crane," Walter turned. "My name is Raymond Marsh," the man said. Walter looked at him. He recognized the name with the full weight of what it meant. He said nothing because there was nothing immediate and useful to say. Raymond Marsh did not look like an antagonist. He looked like a man who had driven a long way to see something and had seen more than he expected. "I came to look at the property before the sale closed Monday," he said. "I wanted to see it one more time before the paperwork was final." He looked at the kitchen, at the organized stations, at Harold's blueprint on the wall at the pass-through window, with its view of a full and living dining room. "I didn't expect this." "What did you expect?" Walter asked. "An empty building," Raymond said. "Or close to it. A couple of people trying something that wasn't going to amount to much." He looked at the blueprint on the wall. "Is that Harold's? Found it in the storage room, behind a wall panel." Raymond was quiet for a moment, looking at his uncle's handwriting. The careful block letters of the title, the penciled note at the bottom, still legible across 37 years. "He used to talk about this place," Raymond said. "Every time I visited when I was a kid, he'd take me here on Saturday mornings. He'd sit me up on the counter stool and introduce me to everyone who came in, and he'd talk about the improvements he was going to make, the things he was going to do when the time was right." He paused and something in his face shifted. "He never got to do them. He drew those plans the same month the mill closed," Walter said. "I know." Raymond looked at the blueprint for another moment, at his uncle's handwriting in the title block, at that penciled line at the bottom. Then he looked at Walter. "I called the development company 45 minutes ago, from the parking lot." He said it simply, without drama, the way you say something when you have already made peace with the cost of it. "The deal is off." Walter did not move. "I'm not a wealthy man," Raymond said. "I'm a high school teacher in Lexington. That sale was supposed to be my retirement. I want to be honest with you about that because I don't want you to think this is a small thing I'm offering." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded sheet of paper. 150,000, below market, below what the development firm was paying. "I'll hold the deed for 6 months, no rent, No fees while you organize the community purchase. He set the paper on the counter. My uncle spent his whole life building this place. He believed in what it was for people. The least I can do is give the right people a chance to continue what he started. He looked at Walter directly. Finish what he started, he said. That's all I'm asking. Walter found Caleb at the counter and told him quietly. Caleb went very still, the way people go still when news arrives that is too large to absorb standing up. Then he exhaled slowly and looked at his father with eyes that were doing what eyes do when feeling outpaces the ability to contain it. We're going to need to tell everyone, he said. I know. They need to know what we're still short. We can't let them think this is solved when it isn't. I know, Walter said again. He called for attention the way men of his generation call for attention, not with volume, but with stillness, standing in the middle of the room and waiting until the quiet spread outward from him like something moving through water. The room settled. He told them about Raymond Marsh. He told them about the $150,000 offer and the 6-month window. He told them about the jar on the counter, which Caleb had quietly counted twice during the morning and which stood at $11,400. He told them they were still more than $100,000 short. The room absorbed this. Walter stood in the middle of the Millstone Diner with the people of Crestfall around him and felt the weight of what he was about to ask people who had already given time and labor and groceries and pipe fittings and cleaning supplies and the specific irreplaceable gift of showing up. He was about to ask them to believe that what they had was enough to build something lasting when the arithmetic said it might not be. He looked at the guest book on the counter. He had not planned this. It arrived the way real things arrive, not from planning, but from necessity, from the moment requiring something true. He picked up the guest book and opened it to the June 1961 page. I want to read you something, he said. The room was very quiet. This is from the guest book. June 14th, 1961. He found the line with his finger. He read it aloud in the voice he used when he wanted something heard properly, clearly, without decoration. William Crane passing through Crestfall. Best coffee in Kentucky. He looked up. William Crane was my father, he said. He passed through this town 63 years ago. He sat somewhere in this room and drank coffee and thought it was worth writing down. I didn't know that until 3 days ago. He paused. I came to Crestfall because my truck died on Route 9, and I had $43 and nowhere else to be. I didn't choose this town. I didn't choose this building. But my father sat in it 63 years ago, and Harold Marsh drew plans for its future in the same summer it was dying, and somewhere between those two things I found something I didn't know I was looking for. He set the guest book on the counter. He had said what he needed to say. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something true has been said in them, and the truth is still moving through the air, still being absorbed. Then Caleb stepped forward. He picked up the pen from beside the guest book. He found the page, the June 1961 page, the entry in Walter's father's handwriting. He looked at it for a moment. Then beneath his grandfather's words and beneath the entry Walter had made the night before the opening, Caleb wrote slowly and clearly, taking care with each letter, Caleb Crane, December 1st, 2024. We came back to finish what he started. He set the pen down. Dorothy Mercer was the first to move. She walked to the jar on the counter and placed her hand on it without adding to it, just rested her hand on the glass for a moment, as if making contact with something, as if confirming that it was real. Then she went to find her handbag. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that movie moments are dramatic. It was quieter than that and more complete. People moved around the room, talking to one another, pulling out wallets and phones and address books. Earl called 3 people who had grown up in Crestfall and moved away, reaching them in other states, explaining in the unhurried way of a man who does not waste words and trusts that the right words will be enough. Agnes got on the phone with the owner of the grocery supply company in the next county over a man she had done business with for 20 years and who owed her more than a few favors. Roy Harmon wrote a check with the careful, deliberate penmanship of a man for whom writing a check is still a significant act, tore it from the book and placed it in the jar. Gideon Doyle's 2 sons stepped outside together and made calls to people in their towns. One of them came back 20 minutes later with a figure written on his phone, a commitment from people who had heard what was happening and wanted to be part of it. Margaret Briggs posted something that was shared 200 times in the first hour, reaching former residents of Crestfall in 15 states. The jar on the counter kept filling. Walter stood in the middle of it and let it happen around him and understood that this was not something he could have built. You cannot build community. You can only create the conditions for it show up honestly, do the work with care, and then step back and let people choose. You can only make the space and let them decide what to do with it. These people were choosing. The day wound down slowly the way good days do not, with a sharp ending, but with a gradual easing. Fewer people and longer conversations, the late afternoon light coming through the windows at the low angle of early December. By 4 o'clock, the crowd had thinned to the core group, the people who had been there from the beginning. They sat in the booths and at the counter, and nobody was in a hurry to leave. Dorothy and Nora washed the last of the dishes. Caleb tallied the day's final numbers at the counter. His head bent over the notebook, his handwriting, the precise and efficient script of a man who communicates more clearly in numbers than in most other languages. Walter cleaned the kitchen. He did it the way he did everything, thoroughly, without shortcuts, working his way across each surface from left to right. He scrubbed the griddle, he degreased the range, he restacked the trays and returned every utensil to its place. He wiped down Harold Marsh's blueprint on the wall, careful not to disturb its corners. When he was finished, he stood in the clean kitchen and looked at it. Caleb appeared at the pass-through. "Total for the day," he said. "Cash and checks in the car plus commitments from people who called in 11,400 from the jar. Another 22,000 in commitments from calls made today." He paused. Margaret's post has been shared over 400 times in the last 3 hours. There are people reaching out from Louisville, Lexington, Nashville, Atlanta, former residents who want to be part of this. Another pause. "It's not over." Walter looked at his son. "No," he said, "it's not. 5 months is not a long time in the life of a building that has stood for 70 years. But in the life of a town that had spent 2 decades learning to expect less, 5 months was enough. The fundraising campaign moved in ways that Walter could not have predicted, and that Caleb tracked with the systematic precision of someone who had found his purpose in the organizing of complex things. Former residents of Crestfall made contributions from addresses across the country, people who had driven away in the 1990s and the early 2000s and had never stopped carrying the town with them, who had been waiting without knowing it for something worth coming back to. A feature piece in a Louisville paper was picked up by a wire service and ran in 17 states. A Kentucky state grant for rural revitalization applied for by Agnes Whitfield in December, pushed through in March by a state legislator who was looking for exactly this kind of story to champion, provided $20,000. By the end of April, the total was $162,000. Raymond Marsh signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon in Earl Hutchins's living room because the town had no lawyer's office large enough for the occasion, and Earl's dining room table was the largest flat surface available. Raymond shook Walter's hand and said nothing dramatic because the occasion did not require it. He had said what needed saying in December in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and coffee, standing in front of his uncle's blueprint. The cooperative was formed with 43 founding families, each purchasing a share at $500. Walter and Caleb received shares voted to them by the board in recognition of what the lawyers called sweat equity, which is the formal term for the kind of investment that doesn't show up on financial statements, but without which nothing real gets built. Earl Hutchins became president of the board. Dorothy Mercer became treasurer. Agnes Whitfield took operations. The diner opened for breakfast on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, with a waiting list for the counter stools on Saturday mornings that stretched 3 weeks out by the time February arrived. Walter cooked. Caleb managed everything else with Nora beside him, increasingly beside him, in ways that extended beyond operations, and scheduling, the quiet fact of them becoming a them, acknowledged by everyone in the way small-town communities acknowledge such things, which is without announcement, simply by adjusting their assumptions about the future. On a morning in late April, Gideon Doyle and Silas Webb installed the new sign. It had been designed and painted by 4 of Margaret Briggs's art students working over 3 weekends in the school's art room, with the focused seriousness of young people who understand that some work matters more than other work, that not everything you do is equivalent, that this particular thing was worth doing right. The lettering was clean and confident. The colors were right, not flashy, not trying too hard, simply correct. It read, "Millstone Diner Community Owned." Since 2025, Walter stood on the sidewalk with Earl and Dorothy and watched it go up, watched Gideon and Silas work with the efficient cooperation of two men who have done enough jobs together that they don't need to talk through every step. "Looks right," Earl said. "It does," Walter said. Dorothy said nothing. She was looking at the sign with the expression of a woman who has been patient for a long time and has learned not to undermine the arrival of a good thing by talking too much about it. Later that morning, Walter asked Declan to come by. Declan was 17, a junior at Crestfall High, one of the students who had shown up to clean the diner in November and had not really left since. He was quiet in the manner of young people who listen more than they speak, which Walter had recognized early as a form of intelligence rather than shyness. The intelligence of someone who understands that you learn more by listening than by talking, that most people reveal everything important about themselves if you give them enough silence to fill. He had been learning kitchen work alongside Walter for 3 months, learning the structural and mechanical basics that Walter considered foundational, how to assess a building, how to diagnose a failing system, how to make a repair that would last rather than one that merely postponed the failure. He arrived promptly, which Walter had also noted. Promptness in a 17-year-old is not common. It indicates something about how a person understands their relationship to time and to the expectations of others. Walter brought him into the kitchen. The toolbox was on the counter. The red metal, the stamped initials, W.C. William Crane. "You've been here 3 months," Walter said. "You show up every time you say you will. You pay attention to what you don't know instead of pretending to know it. You don't stay ignorant of things you could learn." He looked at Declan. "Those are the things that matter in this work. Not talent, not speed, not confidence that outpaces your ability. Those 3 things." Declan waited. "This toolbox belonged to my father," Walter said. "He bought it in 1959 with his first real paycheck. He gave it to me when I started my first job. I've been carrying it for 35 years. He paused, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. "I'd like you to have it." Declan looked at the toolbox and then at Walter. "I can't take that," he said. "That's yours." "It's mine to give," Walter said. "That's different." He placed his hand on the lid for a moment on the scratched red metal on the stamped initials that were not his, then moved it aside. "Tools are meant to be used. They're meant to pass from one person to the next when the time is right. These tools have built things in 3 states and outlasted every circumstance I've put them through. They deserve to keep working, and the work they deserve to do is ahead of them, not behind." He looked at the young man. "Use them well. Take care of them. And when the time comes, when you've taught someone else what you know, when you've found the person who shows up and pays attention and doesn't pretend, you pass them forward." That's the agreement. Declan took the toolbox. He held it with both hands in the careful attention of someone who understands the weight of what they have been given, not just the physical weight. "I will," he said. "I promise." After he left, Walter stood alone in the kitchen. The toolbox was gone. The counter where it had sat was bare. He looked at the space for a moment, at the absence of the thing that had been there. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced the folded paper, the note his father had left in the lining of the box, the note he had found on the first night in this building, in the cold, in the dark, when he had needed something real to hold on to. He had kept it. He had not passed it with the box because it was not meant to be passed. It was meant to be put somewhere it could be seen. He had already had it framed. A small frame, plain wood, nothing ornate, nothing that would call attention to the frame rather than to what was inside it. He hung it on the kitchen wall to the left of the pass-through window where he would see it every morning when he was working, where it would be the first thing in his line of sight when he looked up from the range. Beside it, he hung Harold Marsh's blueprint, weighted and mounted properly now, on the same wall, the penciled note at the bottom, still legible across 37 years. "If I can get through this winter, I can save this place." 2 men who had never met. 2 things they had left behind in this building. Walter stepped back and looked at them together for a long time. It was May before Crestfall felt like spring. Kentucky springs are like that. They take their time arriving, and then when they come with conviction, the kind of warmth that is not tentative, but definite, that says, "This is real, this is lasting, you can count on this now." The trees along Main Street had come back. The weeds in the sidewalk cracks were still there, but had been joined by other things, volunteer flowers that had seated themselves in the cracks and decided to stay. On a Thursday morning, Walter was in the kitchen at 5 o'clock. The diner didn't open on Thursdays. It was his morning to be alone in the kitchen to do the preparation work for the weekend without the pressure of service to move at his own pace through tasks that needed doing. He had come to value these mornings more than he had expected to. They were quiet in a way that nourished rather than isolated the quiet of a place that has been filled with people and holds the shape of their presence even when they're gone. He had coffee going. He set both hands flat on the counter, the wood surface he and Caleb had sanded together on a cold November afternoon, the grain coming up clean under the work, the old scars of 37 years still visible, but integrated now part of the surface rather than damage to it, the way old wounds become part of a person rather than defining them. The wood was warm under his palms, solid, real in the way that things are real when they have been worked with and worked on and brought to a state of usefulness. He looked up at the wall, his father's note in its plain frame. Crane men build, they don't run, Harold Marsh's blueprint beside it. The kitchen as Harold had imagined it, the kitchen as it now was not identical, but in conversation with each other, the vision and the reality talking across 37 years, the plan and the completion finally occupying the same wall. Walter looked at them for a long time. He thought about the truck dying on Route 9, the $43. The cold of that first night on the floor with the sleeping bags and the canned soup and no idea what came next. He thought about the note in the bottom of the toolbox which he had not known existed until he needed it. He thought about the blueprint in the wall, Harold's attempt at a future that got interrupted before it could begin. He thought about his father's handwriting in a 63-year-old guest book, the coffee notation of a young man passing through a town he would never return to, leaving evidence of himself in a place he couldn't have known would matter to anyone, let alone to a son he hadn't had yet. He thought about Caleb. Caleb, who had given up everything to drive south with a father who had lost everything and who had not stopped believing that something could be built from the wreckage and who had turned out to be right about that. Caleb, who had written, "We came back to finish what he started" in a guest book in front of a room full of people and who had meant every word of it. Caleb, who was upstairs right now in the small apartment they had made from the storage space above the kitchen, sleeping beside a woman who asked real questions and expected real answers, building the kind of life that starts small and becomes something you didn't anticipate. He thought about what he would have said if you had told him 6 months ago, standing on the shoulder of Route 9, with the truck's engine gone quiet and the future nowhere visible, and $43 in his wallet, that this is where he would end up. In a kitchen that smelled like coffee and clean wood and the good work of the morning ahead. With a community that had chosen to build something rather than accept another loss. With a son who had become his partner in the truest sense of the word, not because Walter had asked him to, but because Caleb had chosen it. With work that mattered and people it served, and a reason to be up at 5 o'clock that was not anxiety, but purpose. He would not have believed you. He was glad now that no one had told him. Because the believing had to happen one day at a time, one repair at a time, one cup of coffee made from a percolator that had no business working and worked anyway. The believing had to be earned the same way the work was earned, through showing up when it was hard, through not running. Even when running was the simpler thing, through staying in the difficult place long enough for something to clarify. He heard movement upstairs, Caleb getting up early. He would be down in 20 minutes. Walter turned to the range. He had hash browns to prep. He had batter to check. He had cinnamon rolls to start. The recipe was his. Now the muscle memory of it, complete his hands knowing every step without having to think about it, which is the definition of something truly learned. Not information you carry, but knowledge that has become part of how you move. He reached for the flour. The percolator on the counter did its patient, reliable work. Outside, Crestfall was beginning to come awake in the May morning light. Down the block, the new bookstore opened at 8. A woman named Harriet, who had moved back from Cincinnati to open it, who said she had seen the piece about the diner and thought if they can do it, maybe I can too. 2 doors down from the bookstore, a coffee shop was under renovation. Its windows newly unboarded a young couple from Louisville who had been looking for somewhere slower and had found it. On Main Street, the banner from 2022 was gone. Someone had taken it down in December and replaced it with nothing, because nothing was more honest than a sign announcing something that wasn't happening anymore. Things were happening now. Different things. Smaller things, some of them, but real ones, the kind that accumulate into something over time, that build the way good things build without announcing themselves. Walter worked. He thought briefly about the toolbox in Declan's hands, about the tools worn smooth by 3 generations now, in a fourth set of hands moving forward into a future he would not be present for. That was the right order of things. That was what the tools were for, not to be possessed, but to keep working. You used them to build what you needed to build, and then you gave them forward, and the building continued past you beyond the edge of what you could see. The note on the wall said, "Crane men build. They don't run." Walter had run for a year. He had driven south in a failing truck with a dwindling supply of money and a son who deserved better and a shame too heavy to examine directly. He had run, and the truck had died on Route 9, and he had walked into a town that had also been running away from itself for 20 years, running from the loss of the mill, from the departure of its people, from the slow diminishment of everything it had been. And somehow, in that convergence of two things that had both run as far as they could run, something had found its footing. He was not running anymore. He was standing in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and the good work of the morning ahead, in a building that 2 men had tried to save at different times, and that was still standing, and he was making something with his hands for people who would come through the door in a few days and sit down and be fed and feel, even if they couldn't have said exactly why, like they were part of something that mattered, like they were in the right place, like the place was glad to have them. He was exactly where he needed to be. He smiled. Not the performance of a smile, not the reflexive expression that people put on for others, the real thing, the kind that comes from somewhere below the face and works its way up without being summoned. The kind you can't manufacture or decide to have. The kind that only arrives when a person is standing in the right place, doing the right work at the right time with the right people nearby. He smiled and turned back to his counter and started his day. The Millstone Diner opened for breakfast every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. The guest book filled a new page every week. Harold Marsh's blueprint stayed on the kitchen wall. The note from William Crane stayed beside it. The jukebox played on Saturday mornings until noon. Dorothy selecting the songs, and people lingered longer than they needed to because the room gave them something they hadn't been getting anywhere else. And on a county road 9 miles south of Crestfall, a rusting sign still pointed toward a town that had decided after a long time of forgetting that it was worth the trouble of continuing, that the people still there were worth building something for, and that the people who had left might come back if there was something worth coming back to. Most things worth saving are saved by people who had no particular reason to stay. Walter Crane had no particular reason to stay. He stayed anyway. And that in the end was the whole of it.